who is an online Catholic apologist and evangelist who caught my eye for his street evangelization videos, which I feel like are rare in the Catholic online space. And today we're going to have a conversation on a few different topics, as myself as a former Catholic apologist who has now left the church, and Minh, who's still in the church and doing some awesome work out there. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Cade. Yeah, so my name is Minh, and just a Catholic apologist. I love evangelizing, reading the Word of God, and I'm super honored to be here.
Awesome. So before this, we kind of wanted to hit on three mainish topics: homosexuality, atheism, and suffering slash evil. We'll both kind of be leading the conversation here. Out of those three things, which one should we start off at? And I think each of these conversations could be like 2 hours, but I think we'll move through these as kind of the conversation flows. So I guess where do we want to start off?
Yeah, and by the way, Cade, just take me through the flow. We can start with atheism first, I guess, if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would love to hear like your position on atheism, like perhaps how you would define it, and how did you come to the conclusion of atheism?
Yeah. So I would use the label of igtheist, which is a branch within atheism,
Hmm.
which essentially states that the words and the ideas around the conception of God, so all powerful or omnibenevolent, all of these words are so vague, so ill defined, and beyond our investigation that to make any knowledge claims about God would seem inappropriate from our epistemological limitations. And so the idea of like, does God exist or not, I almost find as a mute point because we still couldn't know anything about this entity that's out there, tends to be my position in place within the atheist school of thought.
Yeah, okay. So it seems like, would you say, for example, hey, there's this being that is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and obviously we are limited in certain ways, and so how are we supposed to prove him? Is that the sort of idea?
Yeah, it's and another way that I tend to state things is that I've never seen a sound epistemology to anchor dogmatic theology. Like if somebody comes up to me on the street and they say, "I believe in this kind of vague idea of a creator, and I hope that he loves me," that's like awesome, man. Like live your life, pick a belief that works for you. I tend to have a problem when Catholics go into these conversations with these preconceived notions about divine simplicity, about specific aspects of God as these dogmatic presuppositions moving into the conversation, because I don't think that we can know anything about this God out here to begin with.
Okay, yeah. So that's interesting. So for example, I mean, consider, I think this is one of the cases where okay, we're walking to a cabin. I forgot where I got this from, but you walk towards a kind of cabin, somewhere in the jungle, and you see that there's just like a hot, cup of coffee just laying right there, right? And so even though you don't see anybody there, you would, for example, rule out certain possibilities. Like most likely a bear did not make that hot cup of coffee, but you would say something like, okay, probably it's some kind of intelligent being that's able to make the coffee. So possibly an alien, but most likely a human being. So that's how I would usually reason to God. We start first with I think from the realm of possibilities and probabilities. So wherever it's more likely that God does exist, we see whatever evidence is through the world, through the creation that God has given us. So that's in Romans 1 and onward. Romans 1 2, we see that natural law kind of idea as well. But also through the natural workings of God, God can be seen in the book of wisdom as well in the Bible. And so I think that there are ways in which we can infer that there is such a being that exists. And I think the Catechism also mentions this, which is the idea where whenever we sort of make an analogy about God, this is my paraphrasing, there's an even greater disanalogy in the sense that, say, for example, Cade is a good person, okay? And I say Cade is a good person like God is a good person, or like Jesus is a good person. The thing here is, yes, there is an analogy right there, and we can sort of see what we mean by good. But the moment that I say that, we recognize from further investigation that there's a greater disanalogy in the sense that God here would be the infinite good, whereas Cade is the finite good. And the infinite good is, well, infinitely greater. And so there's this infinite gap. And yet we can still infer that there is a great God, a good God from certain things that come about. I think, for example, one of the interesting arguments I found out what was his name? Let me see if I have
Mhm.
it right here in my notes. But basically, the problem of evil actually is a something like evil, for example, on the naturalistic kind of account. I think that would be problematic because evil seems to be very in a way it's very structured and it has a kind of limitation. It's so we can say in one sense it is disordered. So like it's something that we don't want, for example. But Trent Dougherty, there's a guy, he's a Catholic, I think. Basically, he argues that the distribution of evil could have fallen along many different dimensions, so far more, far less, or even none. But if naturalism were true, then or sorry, it could fall on any of those dimensions if naturalism were true. However, it seems that it falls along the quite narrow dimensions that are conducive for goods considered to be one of the highest value by most of us, and especially by religious people. And I would say one of the greatest goods that come from certain evils are virtues. So let me just name some out right here. So we think about, for example, compassion could not be manifested without pain. Patience could not be manifested if we got everything we wanted immediately. So that maybe we consider, that kind of waiting moment as a kind of evil for us. We don't like that. Um, for example, forgiveness could not be manifested without evils like offense committed. Selflessness, as another virtue, could not be manifested without corruption. Courage could not be manifested without danger. Generosity could not manifest without poverty. So these are various virtues that can only be had when God allows certain evils. And given the fact that there is evil, we get to predict that more on the case of theism than say naturalistic atheism, if that's the position that one takes. And that's a whole spiel. I have a lot more to say, but yeah. Initial thoughts or anything?
Yeah, a few thoughts. There's kind of three or four distinct points in there. One on this good versus bad kind of spectrum that's out there. So if we talk about good or a finite good or an infinite good or evil as a privation of good, or goodness being able to come from evil, that's almost to my point that the term goodness is not clear exactly what it means. It does not or when we say goodness, it's kind of this amorphous, vague idea that we're trying to communicate that we don't agree on. And so to say like God is good, there's kind of like three problems with that statement. One is God is this kind of like ill-defined. We can only use our words in an analogous way, as Thomas Aquinas puts out there. And then to say like God is, or this non-physical or this non-physical outside of time, outside of space, outside of matter, for it to be, or so like that is part is like another huge like thing to unpack that seems unclear. And then good, it doesn't seem clear what people are encoding, what we mean, or if we could have an exhaustive definition of what good means. And that's kind of my position when it comes to anything related to God, is that our language breaks down so quickly. Unlike in the sciences, whether it's the gas laws or mathematics, like the ideas communicated are discrete, right? If we're talking about like Pivnert in gas laws, or we're talking about significant figures in math, like we know what we're talking about. When we get to these God discussions, it doesn't seem clear what we're talking about, let alone like these expansive knowledge claims that are out there. Seems like these inappropriate reaches. And as Thomas Aquinas puts out in the Summa, that essentially the way that he moves from the first five arguments for the existence of God to God's quality is by like ruling out possibilities, or that we can make knowledge claims about God by disproving these negatives or proving these negatives that are out there. And so, in many ways, I feel like God discussions tend to be like the analogy of these blind men who are all feeling different parts of an elephant. They all come to different conclusions. Maybe they're getting to like some fundamental truth to begin with, but it seems like we don't have finite terms, and thus we can't have concrete knowledge claims about these finite and ill-defined words when it comes to an entity that we can't investigate using science to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thank you for that, kid. It seems like one of the big things there, perhaps something underlying this is, hey, we must prove things by science, so like a kind of scientism. I don't know if that's exactly your position. At least that's how I'm hearing it, and it seems like that. One of the things that you mentioned is, well, I guess the unclear kind of understanding of good. I mean, even if the understanding of good were unclear, the basic point is many of us, we still use the word good. And we know that others want the good and things of that nature. And in comparison with science, for example, the vagueness of the word good and of God's goodness, of God Himself, in comparison with science, science is not all clear cut. So, for example, Alexander Pruss, I was really struck when I first read this. This is a 2020 kind of blog that he did. So he says photons are waves and particles. So like he's basically naming all these mysteries and things that are strange in science and are paradoxes. So photons are waves and particles. Light from the headlamp on a fast train goes at the same speed relative to the train or relative to the ground. Objects persist while changing. We should not murder, but we should redirect trolleys, for example, etc. So, I mean, it depends on your answer, but most people would probably hold that intuition. But these things are strange at the fundamental level in the realm of science, and I would say also in the realm of morality. Aristotle mentioned this in his Nicomachean Ethics. I read this recently, where he basically, he has his account of virtue ethics, and in one of the parts, basically, he was shown, yeah, though we have this sort of account, it's not always clear what the good is, right? So he recognized, especially in the realm of morality, in the realm of ethics, there are certain counterexamples that are just really hard to answer, and I think that a lot of theories will have to bite the bullet. But I would say that we cannot presuppose, for example, a scientism before actually examining the evidence. So, for example, not everything can be proven by science, including that very proposition of everything must be proven by science. That cannot be proven by science in the kind of scientific method that we have. Or, for example, love. Love is not reducible to the molecules that we have. And it's like, are we really willing to bite that bullet as well to just say that it's reducible to the molecules? I would say that when we get to the realm of God being good, there are certain arguments that I would bring forth. I mean, unless you're ready to go over that, I would love to bring forth certain arguments as to why I think God is good and why He does in fact exist as the omnipotent, omniscient being that He is.
Yeah, a few points in there. I kind of call this like epistemological quicksand, which is when in discussions with an apologist, you kind of point to science, and though science isn't the perfect end all be all of knowledge, an apologist will rightly point that out, but then take it a step further, which is because we can't have this absolute or this absolute certainty even about science, we kind of like admit philosophy and ethics as like equally valid. And I think it's inappropriate because we have confidence intervals. Like with science, though the proposition the only thing we can know truly is something from science, is in itself derivative from the scientific method, it is nonetheless, I think, intuitive that we can have much higher confidence intervals with science because we can experiment, we can interact, we can have consensus, and if you don't like it, you can run out and run your own tests. And in science, science sits on this like barrier between the known and the unknown. And that as we progress as a scientific field, for example, you brought up quarks when we talk about photons, when you talk about gravity, these are rapidly expanding fields, but nonetheless, we can have more and more certainty as we start testing. Whereas in these God debates, it seems like we've gotten no closer to consensus, to agreement, to testing, to any sort of definitive way to get to truths or dogmas in the past few thousand years. Unlike science, though science doesn't know everything, it's expanding and has consensus. Unlike religion, it seems like we've been stuck in the mud for thousands of years. And so, yeah, I think we can have a much higher confidence interval around, let's say, scientific principles. Then we can have ethics. Then we can have these ideas of love. Yes, it's kind of a stab in that direction. And into your point, I think, yeah, things break down at their fundamental levels. And so when people try to do what I call like word science when it comes to proofs for the existence of God, right? We look at the beginning of the universe and how to start. But then we apply our everyday intuitions about, let's say, the Big Bang. Whereas in science, it's actually a lot of both applied and theoretical mathematics, and we can do tests on it. And so, like we can expand knowledge there. But when it comes to philosophy, it seems like we play word games for thousands of years and get no closer to defining God or metaphysics or really anything that's out there. is kind of a stab at that response.
Hmm. Yeah, so it seems like you were mentioning the confident intervals right there. You were mentioning something like it's intuitive that we have confidence in science because of consensus and you can test it. Well, I can say the same thing basically about philosophical reasoning in philosophy of religion, right?
Mhm.
So if I say, for example, the argument from change is such that it finally proves that there's this pure being that itself is not changing, but is the changer of other beings, or if I use Alexander Pruss going from Leibniz and possibly somebody before with the PSR, the principle of sufficient
Mhm.
reason, that every contingent being, which I would define as beings that could possibly not exist, with these contingent beings, they would require some other cause or some other reason for its existence. And so ultimately, at the very ground of it, we would say that it would have to be at least one kind of necessary existent being that itself is not grounded in another being, and so that would bring forth and presumably that would be God, right? And actually I think it was Graham Priest on one of the on Majesty of Reason, the Majesty of Reason YouTube
Mhm.
channel. He is an agnostic. I love his channel, but he basically mentioned actually this claim that we don't really have much improvement, say in philosophy specifically. I would not say specifically religion, which seems to be a distraction. I would say that we can go to the philosophy of religion, the various philosophies that we have out there, and we see clearly that there are philosophical improvements. For example, one of the big improvements is in concerning the PSR. Basically, almost every philosopher that's I would say credited would accept that there is this necessary one, at least one necessary being for the contingent beings that are in existence. So that's number one. And number two, I think you were mentioning, for example, yeah, philosophical arguments have been growing like science. And if I'm not mistaken, I heard something along the lines of like a kind of hint at the fine tuning argument. Um, if I could propose that as well, the fine tuning argument itself is very interesting. So I have Michael Huemer here, knowledge, reality, and value. He himself is like an agnostic or something like that, but he was finding himself very convinced by this argument. So according to one estimate, if you randomly picked a possible initial state for a universe, the probability of picking one with such a low entropy is about 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 124. And here he cites the selfish gene. Yeah, so he cites some book. But basically, the low initial entropy, in turn, is crucial to explaining life and everything else in the universe we care about. So the conditions that the universe needed to be in the very beginning for life to come about needed to be so exact to finally have life come about. And the fact that we do have law-like regularity currently right now is better explained on theism, where there is indeed this intelligent being that is ordering things towards some kind of end with kind of law-like regularity, and it's made the universe such that the universe is life permitting with so little, probabilities. That provides better evidence for theism than atheistic naturalism, which is the view that hey, we just have these, we use the principle of indifference, where at the base of everything, it's just these little molecules, and they're indifferent, non-conscious. So that's one thing. And the another thing, it better explains our consciousness, right? So you were mentioning the kind of consensus that we can have. Even to have consensus and to have this kind of test, like, hey, I'm a lay person, I want to test this philosophical argument, I want to test this religion out, I want to test this scientific theory. Even with that, I have to have some kind of consciousness. And theism, because it has at least one conscious being, namely God himself, is better to explain the phenomena of the various consciousness out there than naturalistic atheism, which just has, little molecules that are indifferent to having consciousness, and it does not have consciousness itself. So those are some points.
Yeah. So I mean, you started with kind of the argument from change, the argument from motion, depending on how you kind of parse through some of those. And so even this idea like change is such a loaded word that it's not clear or discrete or exhaustive of what we mean. Like, if we say change is the actualization of a potential, there's like 4 or 5 competing schools of thought on just the idea of change and just the idea of cause that's out there, or existent beings that are out there, or disembodied minds. Um, like just the word change and the words that we're using are so far up for debate that it seems like to extrapolate on these shaky grounds seems like we don't get to any justified true belief, which kind of leads into your second point on improvements in philosophy. And I think philosophy is important. I think it's something that we do all day, but yet the field doesn't move at the rate that we have science. Like we might have updates on the principle of sufficient reason, but then on the other side with science, like we're getting penicillin, we're getting people to the moon, we're improving drinking water, like we're rapidly accelerating. In philosophy, I find important, but I more or less see it as a sort of like a therapy for our intuitions versus a way to extrapolate concrete knowledge claims that are out there. On the idea of the fine tuning argument, I find interesting problematic on on two sides. One, we have this counterfactual element, which kind of relies on this like it's a 0.001% chance that this gravitational constant is this way, except that we don't know the counterfactual element, which is to assign a probability. Like we have a gravitational constant or the speed of light, cool. So for it to be that was like a this percent chance or it's likely or unlikely seems like we don't have access to that knowledge to look at percents. And it also seems like I think this idea of fine tuning almost makes more sense on a non-theistic view of the world because it would be strange for God to create the universe on such a razor's edge. Both the billions of years that it took to get to his creation, the size of space that's out there, right? We are so tiny in comparison to this universe that it seems strange if God created the universe for us to make it so inhospitable to life. And then to extrapolate any data to go kind of back to your, we find a cabin in the woods, and like we might be able to infer some vague generalities, but to make knowledge claims about the person that put it there seems like a leap, and especially to put those knowledge claims above something that we can see under science. And then even this dichotomy of theism versus atheism and explanations. I don't see that we have this dichotomy here between the two worldviews, both on theism and atheism have so many shades both in of themselves and in between them that to kind of go it's this or this also seems to break down. And to your point, like our intuitions break down, especially on the quantum level at the beginning of the universe, or extrapolating things out there. Same thing with consciousness. Like we don't know exactly what we're saying. We don't know to what degree is this physical, is this not physical, like what's out there. And I think so much of after having studied these apologetic arguments from so long, it seems like the best that they get to is like, oh, I don't know. Like let's look into that versus we have to have this presuppositional idea of God to like have any knowledge claims and to live our lives around it. It seems fun to dive into these arguments, but I think even on their best day, all they prove is a vague generality versus join a particular political institution or bow down before this particular authority seems so shaky to extend quite that far out.
Yeah, thank you for that, Cade.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned here the shaky ground of the argument from change because change is unclear. I think you mentioned like there were four different views of change. Well, okay, we can bring forth those challenges. I mean, I think, for example, even in the sciences, we will have challenges. In the realm of history, we will have challenges. So I'll give an example. Very absurdly, many lay historians and people, I think, who are very uncredited and they will oftentimes claim that Jesus never existed. But I mean, even John Dominic Crossan, who was an atheist and very well known, I mean, Jesus' existence and Bart Ehrman, Jesus' existence, those things are just so well evidenced that we should not be doubting those things, and yet we do have people doubting them. So in the realm of history, in the realm of science, there will be different various scientific theories, views out there. The question is, what better explains the phenomenon? And we will go with whatever better explains things. And secondly, I think when we are examining these philosophical arguments, we don't necessarily need to join a particular religion, institution / authority, as you mentioned. For example, Anthony Flew, he was an atheist for some time, and then eventually he found himself convinced by the Aristotelian argument from change, showing that hey, there's this God that is the the unchanged changer. So it changes everything in the world. So there is change happening right now, the actualization of certain potentials. And this being presumably would be like all powerful, all knowing, because it changes everything. One thing to add, hey, why is it one being, for example, instead of two or three or four unchanging beings? Well, one of the, I think the principles that we can take, and this is something that many scientists would assume as well, is let's go with a simpler explanation with more explanatory scope and explanatory power. So that means, hey, like, let's reduce the amount of entities or the amount of claims that we make. So if we can show how the world comes about through this one being instead of two beings, well, let's go with one, because then we have to defend less in that sense. It's a modest claim. Another thing I think you mentioned, the counterfactual of the fine-tuning argument. We don't know the counterfactual element to assign probability. Well, I mean, I guess we just appeal to authority here, right? So like there are certain, like Luke Barnes has done some work on this. We just do that. We just appeal to authority, a legitimate authority, not as in the logical fallacy. Second thing, you said that it's better explained on non-theism. Okay, that's very surprising. I would say so, and then you also mentioned the universe being really big and how we finally came, to be after like a really long time. It seems like, well, it's better explained on non-theism. I would ask, why is that? It doesn't seem very clear to me. It's not intuitive that it's better explained on non-theism. Secondly, one of the other explanations is, well, we are small in the universe, so there are these big planets, big stars, and all the rest. Precisely to show how big God is and how powerful He is and how small we are, how we ought to be, for example, humble. So there are various other explanations that I could just come up right now as to why that could be. But the fact of the matter is there is consciousness, even if we do not know, for example, whether it's physical or not. Whether it's physical or not, I think Dustin Crummett, who actually he is, I think, a liberal kind of theist, a liberal kind of Christian. So I mean, he accepts homosexuality and all the rest. Very interestingly, he brought forth this kind of argument from, hey, why is it this sort of psychophysical harmony as well? So it's like, hey, when I get burnt, right? So why is it that I have this painful burning sensation instead of a pleasure in being burnt, right? And ultimately, it would lead into being better explained by theism than non-theism. So that's also connected with consciousness. And then I think you mentioned shades of theism. Well, I would say the same about atheism. You have shades of atheism. Certain atheists are this way, and then another might be different. You might also have polytheism. You might also have, I don't know, like just at the fundamental levels, you have these little molecules that are actually conscious. I think, who was the guy who argued for that? I forgot his name. Okay. But I also, am very interested, if you want to really narrow down the specific religion. So say, for example, okay, we're arguing about all these gods. We can also narrow down to the specific religion by examining the historical evidence of Jesus' existence, death, burial, and resurrection. And if he resurrected, that's a miracle in proof of Christianity. And if Christianity, then everything follows, right? It would be as if, hey, my arm was, I don't have my arm, and then somehow God comes to me in a vision. He says, hey, Minh, I'll heal you tomorrow. And then it actually happens where I get my arm back tomorrow. Well, that would be very impressive, and everything follows. And this Christian God who appeared to me, everything follows in that way.
Here's an interesting question. How confident are you that the Catholic conception of God is true?
Like, do you want me to put a number on it, or?
Yeah, if you had to either put a number on it or a similar belief that you hold to the same confidence level.
A similar. I would at least. I don't know about similar. I need to think on that further, but I would say 100% for God. And my sort of understanding is not just philosophical, but it's obviously, as you can probably guess, it's about faith as well. So
yeah. Would you say that you have that? Are you more confident in the existence of God than, let's say, Newtonian physics, or some of the hard sciences?
I haven't really examined the sciences out there. I just sort of trust them just on authority, right? And I think that we do that as kids in the math class and history class. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with that as long as in the end, there is good evidence for it. And I would say, for example, if I'm sitting in the religion class and my teacher is saying, "Hey, God is good," well, I'm probably gonna trust it as well.
Because I see, I'm working on a script for a long video on. I kind of see there's this continuum of confidence intervals where, let's say, all the way up here is like our hard sciences where we have near complete confidence in physics, in chemistry, in math. Obviously, there's fields within them, but knowing how many protons and electrons are in a particular atom, like we know that. Sure, could you say it's 100%? No, is it 99.998? Sure. And then like a step down there, kind of moving from the right, we have a little less confidence in the fields that are like extrapolations and predictions of the hard sciences. So medicine and economics are kind of predictions and applications of some of the harder sciences, and we're less confident in that. And then we're even less confident in truth claims that we don't have access to. So let's say law and history. And we still have this idea of like predictive utility in history, which is, hey, I think this happened. And then you do some more archaeological digging, and then you see things that like confirm your hypothesis. Same thing in law, like that's why between civil and criminal, like we have different standards of confidence. And then on like the far left, when it comes to beauty and values and art and literature, it's important to us, but like what does it mean for the Odyssey to be true? It's like we didn't really even use truth claims there. And I think that's where God exists, where we kind of have from like the hard sciences through history, we have predictive utility. We have confidence in them in accordance with evidence. And it seems like beauty, God, spirituality, religion, beautiful symphonies are in this non-truth centric kind of epistemological ground where when somebody says believe in God, I think it's important to them. I think it can inform us about how the world works, and I think the arguments for the existence of God are fun to look at the merits of. But unless somebody runs like a purely presuppositional argument to like all of epistemology, it seems like God and the arguments around there are in this beauty and arts and non-knowledge claim types of realities. And so yeah, the hard sciences we seem to have the highest confidence interval with. And is it absolute like well do we know beyond any conceivable doubt that the sun will rise tomorrow? No. But like we know and we can predict that more than we can how God interacts on like the nuances of the divine economy and sacramental grace in a particular parish in the 1700s. Like it seems like such a gross mischaracterization of epistemology in such a stretch that I don't know that we can make any truth claims, even if we say maybe there's a creator out there.
Okay. Do you think that there's a chance that God exists? Some chance, even if it's so small.
How would you define God?
The omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being. At least that much. I would have more to
Yeah.
say, but at least that much. So all powerful, all
Um,
knowing, all good.
I haven't found convincing data out there, even after having studied this for so many years. Is there a chance? Sure, but it's going to be outside of our ability to make knowledge claims. And so almost find it like a mute point.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, that sounds a lot like Immanuel Kant, for example. Immanuel Kant would say that we cannot prove God, neither can we disprove God. But probably, I would guess that yourself and probably other atheists would say that we can disprove God's existence. But if you say that there's a chance, it seems like that is in the realm of some kind of truth claim. So hey, it seems like I don't know whatever X reason you might want to come up with. There's a chance that God exists, right? So it seems like that's a truth claim because you're yeah, it's a proposition itself.
I tend to give the analogy of when I was growing up, at one point, my brothers tried to convince me every time I'd brush my teeth that there was a monster that would come out of the drain in the shower behind me. And then every time I looked back around, it would disappear. And so, like, technically, is that possible? Absolutely. Like, could there always be a monster directly behind me? And anytime there's a camera or mirrors or I turn my head, he shifts. I mean, yeah, could I rule that out? That like technically no. And so is there a knowledge claim there? Kind of. But I think how we move through life is going to rely on these confidence intervals. And if you define something in a way that I don't have access to it, let alone to make knowledge claims surrounding it, I'm kind of just going to go about living my life and not take it seriously until I finally see that monster behind me one day. If I catch him lacking, for lack of a better term.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. So, I mean, consider, for example, that God performs a miracle for you, and He says, "Hey, I'm Jesus, the living God." There's a nice video where the Muslim, one of the Muslim, experienced. I think it was like Jesus touching his shoulder or something,
Yeah.
like that, saying, "I'm Jesus, the living God," and he started tearing up, and I teared up as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just to consider that, like, what if that were a personal experience that happened to you, Cade, or to me? um, like, would we say then that we can make a knowledge claim, a propositional claim kind of idea, a truth claim that, hey, this Jesus, living God guy, he exists?
I think we could make a truth claim that somebody reports and insists on a particular event happening, right? And so, like, there's this long debate between Jordan Peterson and Matt Dillahunty, which is quite a funny exchange where Peterson makes an argument like people only quit smoking when they report a spiritual experience, whether that be religion or shrooms or a psilocybin as a more technical term. And that's proof for the spiritual. And Dillahunty replies that that's proof that people report that happening. And so, is it a proposition that that Muslim person who converted says that they had that experience? Yes. Um, is it a knowledge claim like internally to that person? Like, hey, I've kind of built my life around this experience that I feel very confident that happened? Yes. But for him to then try to like extrapolate data out to me and almost force my hand to like, do you think this did or didn't happen? It's like, I don't know, man. Like, this is in a country with a person that I've never met, with an experience that we have no way of investigating in any way. And to your point, like, and people have asked me, like, what would it take me to be Catholic again? Because I used to go to daily mass. I'd pray all four mysteries of the rosary. I wanted to become a priest. Like, what would it take me to return? And like, the simple answer is like, it would make my life better. And I think we all make decisions that make our lives better, whether it's a personal experience or a group that we belong to or a way of life. Um, and so I think in a certain way, I feel like apologetics diminishes the value of faith. I think there is something beautiful in people deciding to join a particular spirituality. I think there's something beautiful in people grappling with the unknown. What I tend to spend my time finding problematic is this idea of dogma, where you talk to the average Christian and you like, tell me about Jesus, and they'll tell you about how he did this for them, how he made their life better, their beautiful community. And I think it's so dissimilar and cheapens faith then to be like, and we can know that God exists through natural reason and something about divine revelation. Um, Yet it doesn't seem to fit anywhere in this paradigm of like our level of belief should match our level of evidence to go and approach faith with this like I can prove things type of attitude.
Yeah, thank you for that, Cade.
Yeah.
Um, so let's see. You said, yeah, one of the things you mentioned, I think over and over is like the round of beauty. Actually, I want to jump to that in a
Hmm.
little bit. But you made, for example, from one miracle, so this person said that Muslim man, he converted to Christianity. That's a very personal experience. He claimed to have seen this. So that's a miracle claim that is then extrapolated to you. Like, you don't know, like
Yeah.
how's that related, in a way to you? I mean, consider, for example, I believe you hold to emotivism. So
Hmm.
something like, okay, when we say that murder is wrong, it's just basically something like murder boo. It's not really making the truth claim. Okay, consider, for example, that we say murder is wrong. Why would we, for example, if we had the chance to, stop Hitler from killing other people, we would do so, at least from a general standpoint, with certain given conditions. It seems like many of us would have that intuition of just stopping Hitler. But if emotivism were true, it's just something very personal. It's just, oh man, murder, boo, I don't like that. Similar to this Muslim man who converted, this is just very something personal to him and emotion, possibly emotional, but something more psychological to him. But as an analogy to this emotion that we have in emotivism, it's just an emotion that we have. Why are we enforcing it on another person, right? So that's one thing that I think it would be a hurdle to, basically in your worldview. You mentioned, I think, we have decisions that make us something that we think is, like better for us. So, okay, one can be a Christian, one might be an atheist, and live a kind of different life. Consider this, like from the realm, and this is not even really about talking about the truth, say, but let's consider our values, right? Usually, one of our intuitions is, hey, when goodness come about, um, so for example, I commit a good, I should be rewarded for that good in one way or another. And this is an intuition that I think was built um, from us being very young. Okay, similar to this kind of idea, Immanuel Kant would say that, for example, this ultimately good being, God, would exist, and we can hope that he exists because we hope that injustices are, find the people who commit injustice, they find their just deserts. And there should be this kind of recompense for the goodness that is done behind closed doors. So presumably, if we take, for example, the many great things and sacrifices that Mother Teresa did for those in India, we really want, hey, like, is there a recompense for her? What about all these good things that she did behind the closed doors? What about all these people who prayed with such genuine hearts? We really want some kind of recompense right there. So this is on in that realm of value. Or consider, for example, Josh Rasmussen in his book How Reason Leads to God. He mentions something very interesting, which is this realm of reality is like, okay, we see evil, we see there's good, we see triumph, we see failure, suffering, we also see victory. Okay, this is similar to like a very suspenseful kind of perhaps action movie. Like there's this kind of hero theme behind it. And in this sort of movie, we expect certain unexpected turns, certain twists, certain downfalls, and there's also a climax. Oh, but actually, it's not a climax. And then in the end, we find that goodness win out. And so there's this kind of on the realm of value, on the realm of, hey, that looks cool or that sounds cool. I think that Christianity better explains things and is probably more desirable for certain people. Another thing, yeah, I think those things I would say. I think one of the other things you mentioned was the dogmatic kind of side. The thing is, even in the sciences, there's a kind of dogma, and they presuppose the dogmas without realizing that this can be philosophically controversial. So, for example, the principle of identity: X is X, Min is Min, or the principle of non-contradiction: Min is not Min, X is not X. So these things the sciences have to presuppose, and yet when you get to the very bottom level of science and math, which a lot of people think are like so sure, well, guess what? You find things that are very confusing, paradoxical. So the Slit Experiment, you find Gabriel's horn, so like infinite and yet finite. You find Schrodinger's cat. How do we explain these things? Well, presumably we're going to try to progress from that. But so too with philosophy, there will be people who try to, really undermine certain claims. But at the end of the day, we're just going to keep working towards it because, well, reason is what really connects us all, and we should act reasonably. Yeah, so I would say some of those claims when it comes to dogma. So we all have dogma, whether we know it or not.
Yeah, dogma is an interesting point, and one of the things that I haven't made a ton of videos on because it's one of the central reasons why I'd left Catholicism. And so when it comes to sciences, yes, there are both laws and theories out there when it comes to the scientific endeavor. But we also know, to your point on talking about quarks, talking about the slit experiment, talking about all of these things, that Newtonian physics doesn't apply at the quantum level in the way that we know that it happens. Or the beginning of the universe, right? We're talking about E equals mc squared. We're talking about this huge amount of energy rapidly oscillating between energy and matter and back and forth. And so, like, even within science, like the laws of physics, scientists even admit, like, they break down. And when they started looking at the quantum level, they took a look again at their dogma. Like, we've never seen Newtonian physics broken on a beyond or above the atomic level. And so, like, we know that it's a law, but theoretically, if you did an experiment that disproved it, you could become the next pioneer. But in religion, talking about the Immaculate Conception or the hypostatic union, like these positions, you would lose your job over questioning. And if we ever found evidence contrary to, we'd have to we would have to maintain the same dogma. When we're talking about these enumerated dogmas of the Catholic Church, like they can never be updated, they can never be changed. But in science, even our most fundamental presuppositions could be or up to discussion, and we see them rapidly evolving. On the note of desirability when it comes to explaining moral decisions and values, right? Christianity can be helpful, and I think that's to my point on emotivism, which isn't complete sub or isn't saying that morality is subjective, isn't to say that like we're moral realists. And I always give the analogy of like a sports team, like, hey, are the Minnesota Vikings the true sports team? It would be like this inappropriate usage of language, right? Do you mean like the best sports team? And then we can look at concrete data. Or I like or dislike a team, right? If we have one team that's never been convicted of cheating, and we have one team that cheats all the time and their fans come to town and trash it, like it's not subjective, like there are objective facts about it. And I feel like a lot of people get emotivism wrong when they try to like then imbue realism and like imbue truth claims back into emotivism, which is to say that we don't make truth claims and moral claims. Um, yeah, and I think we've gone through a lot on atheism. You'd said you'd wanted to touch on this idea of like the realm of beauty, the realm of the human spirit, which is one of my own like philosophical cookings up of literature and art and God and lifestyle habits aren't truth claims. They're nonetheless important to us. Um, but like me being an ultra marathon athlete isn't a truth claim, but is nonetheless important to my flourishing. Same thing like going to the arts or reading an amazing book are important and moving, and in certain ways more real than like these ethereal philosophical or scientific concepts. But like, is this symphony true? I don't know what that means. Like, is this book true? I don't think the word true should be used there. Well, it's nonetheless helpful and important to our well-being. That might be an interesting place to shift the discussion, since we've kind of hit on a number of points on atheism.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Cade. You were planning to
Yeah.
shift to what exactly? I'm sorry.
So, as I've talked about, like we have the hard sciences, we have the predictive sciences, we have these non-accessible truth claims, and then I think this idea of like God, spirituality, religion, I think are important to people, but I don't think the truth claim like God exists is. I'm not sure how that's a truth or a knowledge claim. It seems like people make decisions that work for them. People have personal experiences. People find value or help in religion, and that's how people make decisions, not philosophical ponderings before they become religious.
Yeah, I mean, so there are certain people who do make that ponderance. I
Yeah.
mean, I mentioned, for example, Anthony Flew and some others. So there are many people who do come from an sort of atheistic background. Actually, some of the friends that I have over here, one of them used to be a Hindu, and then he considered Catholicism from an intellectual perspective, and he found himself convinced and ultimately taking faith in it. So there are such people. The statistical data we're gonna have to see about that. I mean, consider even atheism itself. Like, let's say, for example, that one of the reasons as to why atheism is on the rise is, hey, Christianity, one of the big claims of Christianity is fornication is wrong. Okay, so Jesus says in Matthew 15:19 that fornication proceeds from the heart, and it's, he lists certain things out like an evil thought and all the rest. Okay, so we're supposed to avoid these things that defile us. Okay, Christianity makes those claims, but hey, this kind of atheistic lifestyle allows me to fornicate and I get to indulge in my pleasures, and the availability of other mates is just more prominent nowadays. And so atheism is on the rise, and I have various options given all the freedom that I have. And so let me choose this kind of atheistic institution over this other atheistic institution. And obviously I use that word institution not literally, but
Yeah.
as in this camp and another camp. So I mean, the problems that we're trying to raise for the various flavors of theisms out there can be said also for atheism. And with the various motivations that one might stay in Christianity, I think there are bad reasons to stay as a Christian. So like I don't know, I can think of some examples, but there are bad reasons to be a Christian. So don't just be a Christian because of this terrible reason. So too with atheism, you might just find, well, I love fornicating so much, so, and I just want to indulge my pleasures. Forget what my grandma advised me to not do, which is to not fornicate. So I'm gonna adopt this atheistic lifestyle in my college years, and then maybe towards the final end of my life when I'm weak, I can't do much. I'm just gonna convert. Well, that's not a good way to really reason, and yet I'm sure many people do reason in that way. If I were to speculate, and so it's there are certain background things that we consider, and then we just act out on those things. So it's a problem for both sides. The question is, when it comes to God existing or God not existing, God, we have that subject, and then we have the predicate existing. So it's automatically a proposition, and a proposition is false or true. And so it is a truth claim itself. I mean, this is just basic logic, essentially. And if we really want to get into the specific reason, as I mentioned, why Christianity is true, let's consider the various miracles of Catholicism. Not only the various kind of spiritualities and theological, very beautiful, I find, claims about Mary, the saints, communion, this kind of unitive, relational kind of being aspect. We can find also, for example, there are other various Marian miracles, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Zaytun. Thousands, including Muslims and non-believers, saw apparently this lady on the Coptic Orthodox Church, or Our Lady of Fatima, where apparently like 30,000 plus people saw the sun dancing in the sky, according to their description. It was rainy, and yet towards the very end, suddenly their clothes were dry, and it predicted the end of the World War I, and yet World War II comes about. Or consider, for example, various Eucharistic miracles in I think it's called Lanziano in Italy, in Argentina, and all the rest, where this bread apparently looks like bread, and it somehow turns into this blood tissue, AB blood type, and when we examine it, it is indeed like a kind of from a person who is suffering terribly. And so when us Catholics say that the Eucharist is really Jesus' body and blood suffered on the cross for us, that seems to provide some kind of evidence. And of course, this is not only like a Catholic or Orthodox kind of way of going about things. We can go with the classical, the resurrection of Jesus. So the fact that there was embarrassment, and yet the gospel writers wrote it down. The fact that they proclaimed it in Judea, where they could have been sought out and they could have been killed. These guys who were fishermen, they were willing to do it. The fact that they didn't have much to win, and yet they were willing to share the gospel so boldly. The fact that women were the first ones to witness the resurrection, even in a kind of sexist sort of Jewish culture. And yet the gospel writers were willing to admit that very fact. And I can name a lot more as to why the resurrection is true. Gary Habermas, Mike Licona has, they've done some stuff on this. Basically, there's just a ton of evidence for Christianity, and the atheist who, let's say, for example, that one atheist we were considering who's living that hedonistic lifestyle, he's just turning a blind eye to all this, and that's very sad. He should really consider these things. These are very, very important points because eternity is at stake if eternity exists.
Yeah, a few points there. I I think a lot of Christians set up this false dichotomy. Either it's religion and virtue and long-term planning, or it's non-belief and hedonism. And I find it to not even remotely be the case that atheism and hedonism come together, and religion and, let's say, virtue ethics in that type of lifestyle track as this false dichotomy. I found that even after religion, I kept my habits when it comes to health, when it comes to my values around family and friends and how I make life decisions. I think it's more of a what are the what actually is the goodness that is out there when it comes to fornication. There are pros and cons of nearly any sexual practice, and people have to make informed decisions when it comes to how they want to weigh those pros and cons. And in many ways, I find, having been inside and outside of Catholicism, that in many ways Catholics are more impure than some people on the outside. And so I think to flatten this into any sort of like false dichotomy doesn't is isn't particularly compelling as an argument. Um, and the idea of like God existing, and this is a whole other rabbit hole, another video that I'm working on, is that in many ways I'm like 96% of the way in agreement with Jordan Peterson around the phenomenon of religion. And in many ways, I often say, and I'm working on a script, that Jordan Peterson turned me into an atheist because he seemed to be able to explain the phenomena of religion and the benefits of religion without presupposing a supernatural, all-powerful God that exists outside of time and space. And so, yes, like, do we prioritize things in life? Yes. Do we like worship in some way many things? Yes. But I don't think we even need the supernatural to explain religion. And on the idea of miracles, this is one of like the one of my pet peeves in these debates. We talk about Marian apparitions. Like Fatima is terribly evidenced. All of the claims around Fatima, when we actually look at the documents, don't seem to be there. We have maybe a few dozen actual reports and people who claim to be there. And I always point people to Kevin Non-Tradicath's channel looking at these Marian apparitions. And the evidence there seems, to put it lightly, terrible. Like the predictions have been made after the fact that things happened. The predictions that were said to have happened didn't end up happening. Same thing on Eucharistic miracles, whether it's Lanciano or Tixla or any of these miracles, the science is bad. It's actually some really atrocious science when these like Catholics roll out these arguments. We know that a lot of the times this is mold. We know that the supernatural claims happen hundreds of years after the fact. And then we also have to contend with the fact that nearly every other religion out there has equally or more compelling miracle claims out there. And so either like we allow miracles as explanations, or and so if we allow Catholic Eucharistic miracles, all of a sudden we're having to admit Hindu miracles and Muslim miracles and all of these things out there, which is like another big step when it comes to ecumenism, which is like a whole other rabbit hole to go out to. And like technically speaking, when it comes to philosophy, I don't see how it follows that a miracle evidences a system of belief. So even if we grant all of the facts around Jesus' resurrection, I'm not sure how his resurrection actually evidences the fact I am God, if we want to follow it, because it could be a number of other explanations because we don't have access to the mechanism by which those two things are correlated. And whether it's Gary's work on the resurrection or anybody else's work on the resurrection, seems to be a relatively mundane and poorly evidenced claim out there that there are dozens of alternative explanations that make both more intuitive sense, that seem to explain the data, and that, yeah, the historical claims around the resurrection seem half-baked at best and unreliable at worst, to the point where I don't. Well, there's a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I don't think that there is evidence that demands a verdict. I think it can be a novelty for people to look at, but I don't think we can force somebody's hand when it comes to making a conclusion on the data points, let's say, surrounding the resurrection.
Yeah, thank you for that, Cade.
Yeah.
Yeah, so concerning hedonism, non-belief, by the way, after this, I mean, we could move on to the next thing. It
Yeah.
seems like we've been touching on atheism, God, and all the rest for
Yeah.
quite a while. So we can jump to the next thing if you like. But you
Yeah, let's
mentioned
do it.
hedonism, non-belief. Sorry, was that?
I was saying let's jump in. Yeah, feel free to throw some of your last thoughts out there, and then let's move into kind of our third topic then.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, might as well do it. So it looks like we can. I mean, on the realm of, for example, there's no evidence that demand a verdict. I mean, for example, in the case of courts, there surely is evidence that demand a verdict. I think so. That's that. I would say, for example, concerning hedonism and all the rest, my claim was not that every atheist would live a hedonistic lifestyle. I think a lot of atheists can live like better lifestyles than many of my Catholic friends who are struggling with pornography, with lust, and all the rest. And I pray for them. But the reality is, yeah, like us human beings, we will struggle regardless of the religion or the non-religion that we are in. But the reason that I would say that what I was trying to get at in the original understanding is, I don't know if I said this word, but I was speculating that
Mhm.
especially among many of us, just younger guys, younger women, well, we just want to live that sort of just let me expand my sexual lifestyle, especially in college and all the rest. And so it's very easy to fall into this mentality of Christianity does not allow fornication. I want fornication, so let me leave Christianity kind of idea. So Jordan Peterson, influenced by, yeah, it looks like he was influenced by Edmund Husserl, that focus on phenomena. I would say that, well, even if you focus on the phenomena, you would also need to focus on, the reality of it some way or another. I don't think that you can just stay on the realm of, what seems to be for you. Yeah, Fatima, and it looks like you were trying to raise some speculations or some objections against the various miracles. I would just ask, okay, can we provide the evidence? Because I can, for example, name certain people who would be able to, they show forth their studies. So, for example, Gary Habermas, and he himself is a historian, so he would be one authority out of many, obviously,
Mhm.
in this realm. I think we were talking about, okay, so even if we grant the resurrection, it doesn't show that Jesus is God. How are they correlated? Well, I say that they're correlated because all the claims that Jesus made through our historical data are then true. So when Jesus said, I am who I am, John 8:58, that is connected with Exodus 3:14, wherein God says, I am who I am. And then verse 59 of John chapter 8, the Jews picked up stones to stone him, to try to stone him. Well, that's pretty clear that the reason they're trying to stone him right there is he just claimed to be God. And I mean, there are just so many verses showing that Jesus is God. So that's number one. And number two, Jesus created the church. And this church has leaders that they would later on pass on with information. They would pass on information through oral traditions. We find that, for example, many historians would say, for example, that Mark got his information from Peter, who related the information to him, and then Mark wrote down the Gospel of Mark, for example, and various other things. So, and then eventually, I mean, it's a lot to get into with the early church fathers and the evidence we have there. We get to construct the Bible. We get to see, hey, this is what Jesus said, and there's a lot of great evidence for it in multiple languages at different locations, with different people without great motivation to be writing down what they're writing, and yet they are writing it, proving that, hey, they care about history. So with all these claims, it seems to really go forth in that direction of, hey, okay, we have evidence that Jesus is God. And of course, on the hedonistic point, I mean, that could probably be a segue, I guess, into
Mhm.
our last topic of homosexuality, if you're interested.
Yeah. I'd point on Catholic miracle claims. You're talking about show the evidence. I always point people to Kevin Non-Tradicath's channel, he's an actual chemist who's both looked into the Eucharistic miracles and has some of the most extensive work from a critical lens on the Eucharistic miracles. I often find that like Catholics gesture towards these miracles without actually having read a lot of these Italian doctors' work on it. So Kevin's done the work to actually look at the claims, look at the science. Same thing with around the Marian apparitions. I always point people to his channel, and he has a video dedicated to each of the miracles attributed to Mary and kind of a critical analysis of. Right, a lot of people are like, oh, there's 70,000 witnesses at Fatima. And then Kevin actually looks at like how many witnesses do we actually have? When were they written? What did they write? So I like to throw people there on the claims around the resurrection of the early church. By the time people are listening to this, I'll have about a 3.5 hour video out from an institution in the Catholic Church that essentially tries to prove Catholicism in a 27-page document from like agnosticism all the way to Catholicism. And so a lot of those arguments get addressed in there. So I just point people if they want to dive into what Ming and I are talking about. There is a bunch of other content out there.